And now, from beyond our dimension, this is the JeffMara podcast. Here's Jeff.
My guest is Michael DiMercurio, best-selling author, veteran of the U.S. Navy submarine force, commentator, and humorist who has also had a near-death experience during a Navy diving examination, which we're going to learn about today. Michael, thank you so much for being our guest and welcome to the podcast.
Good to be here, Jeff. Thank you.
All right, Mike, if you don't mind, let's just start on the day that your NDE happened and go from there.
Sure. I guess just a little short background. This was a Navy scuba school. The reason I went there is that submarines need divers to dive the hull and take a look for bombs or mines or, troubling things before we leave port. So, it's a little bit of just a lark to do that, but we knew it would be, useful for the submarine when I reported there a couple months later. I went there with my roommate. This school featured a lot of, physical training, PT, a lot of tests. It was one of those military schools where it almost seems like they want you to flunk out. Fully half of the people who start there don't finish. As an example, one of the tests that they do, they make you fill up a scuba mask and then backstroke in a pool for an hour. And the water goes back down your nose no matter what happens. And for a lot of people, their central nervous system just, completely panics when that happens. And so if you left the pool or stopped backstroking, you flunked. So we flunked a lot of people that day. The final test they had was in a 10-meter tank, a little over 30 feet deep. And they would have instructors who would be waiting in this pool, swimming around, and their job was to punch people and slap people and sabotage people. And the whole reason for that was to stress the student. As one dive instructor said, stressing the diver is important because you have to realize that this is not a pleasure dive, that bad things can happen underwater. And he described an incident where he was diving at the bottom of the Thames River outside New London, Connecticut. They were looking for something. And he swam, down the river looking for things. And all of a sudden he hit a metal wall. And he thought, well, that's kind of strange. I'll just swim up and over this, whatever this metal device is. And as he swam up, he hit another metal wall. So he thought, well, that's strange. So he went left, he hit a metal wall. He went right, he hit a metal wall. He went back the way he came and he hit a metal wall. And the average diver would panic during this and probably drown. What had happened was, without touching the edges of an opening, he managed to swim into a dumpster that had been discarded at the bottom of the river. And he had to find the opening again. But it's like so startling what happened to the guy that, having divers who can manage to get through this stress is important. So in this test, you would throw all your equipment broken down into the bottom of the pool and then jump in after it, take a big breath, and go down there and valve in your regulator and get all the water out of it. Modern scuba regulators are built with a purge mechanism where if you push a button, it gets all the water out and fills it up with air so you can breathe. So when we tossed in our regulators, if they caught you pressing that purge button, you immediately flunked. So 4 weeks of this class would go to waste. So nobody was going to press that purge button. We're just going to use our lungs to evacuate all the water out of the regulator and get it ready so that we could get the rest of our equipment on: weight belt, fins, scuba mask. And meanwhile, all the instructors are swimming around and slapping people and taking your mask off or shutting your air valve or whatever. So for every student down there, there was, for every 2 students, there was 1 dive instructor. So it was pretty crowded in that pool. There were probably 10 of us left in the class by that time. I think we started with maybe 30. So as we went through this, and I put my regulator onto my tanks, and I put the regulator in my mouth. By the time I got that done, with fighting off instructors who were, slapping me and hitting me and, turning off my valve when I was turning it on. I'd probably been under about 2 minutes and I was just completely out of air. So I had blown all the water out of my regulator. It should have worked just fine. In practice sessions, it tended to be okay. But I think I got a defective regulator. And when I, completely out of air, just took in this big whooshing breath, and I just completely flooded my lungs with water. It was just, I didn't even have the ability to stop this. It just, all this cascade of water went into my lungs, and it affected my consciousness immediately. It's sort of like the upper functions of my brain kind of switched off very quickly. And I just had sort of the reptilian part of the brain. I was convulsing and jerking, and every limb was moving. My dive buddy was a Marine Corps swim instructor, so he was putting his regulator into my mouth and trying to get me to cough up the water and stop panicking, but I couldn't. I was just thrashing around. In this test, if your head comes out of the water, you flunk. So my dive instructor, as a point of principle and a point of pride, he was not going to let my head come above the surface. So with all my air gone and with this big, lung full of water, I sort of from a distance watched myself flopping and flailing, and my vision started to tunnel out until the edges of my vision were black. And then that vision sort of, got smaller and smaller until maybe it was the size of an apple, and then it got to the size of a dime, and then it was just a point of light, and then just winked out like an old-fashioned TV going off, and everything was black for a moment. And then there was light, and I'm swimming in a very well-illuminated area, and I'm looking at my dive buddy and myself from about 10 feet away. And my dive buddy is frantically trying to get me to cough out this water. He's trying to compress my lungs almost like an underwater CPR. And meanwhile, all the dive instructors had stopped paying attention to anybody else and were all gathered around me. To give you an idea about this test, they have not one, but 2 ambulances fully staffed waiting up on the deck to revive anybody who drowns. Apparently, drowning during this exercise is fairly common. They even had a name for it. They would call it seeing God. So the dive instructors on a routine basis, nobody was panicked. They were just trying to get me away from my dive buddy. But my dive buddy was this very strong Marine, and he just kept waving them off and telling them everything was going to be okay. And meanwhile, I'm just watching this with this new sense of calm and this feeling that I had all this wisdom. It's very hard to describe, but it's sort of like when you jump into the tank as a normal human being, you've got 10 worries on your mind. How are you going to pay your bills? What's the next assignment that's coming up? Am I going to pass this test? What are my parents doing? Worrying about reporting to the next assignment on the submarine. Are things going to go okay? And then as this was happening, I realized that all those earthly worries and cares, they're all gone. There was no worry at all. I know some people experience euphoria. That didn't happen to me. I was not really euphoric, but I was just very calm. And the fact that I didn't have any worries anymore was a distinctly pleasing feeling. But the other thing was I just had this depth of understanding that I'd never felt before. It was kind of like being a chess master explaining chess to a child. You so much suddenly that I kept describing it as the whole universe suddenly made sense to me. All the mysteries that we normally proceed with, why do we live for so short a time and then die? Things like that just seemed to make sense. I had the answers. I had 1,000 answers in my head, and none of them were crowding each other out. It was just all very normal seeming. So I'm sitting there watching myself drown, or watching my body drown. And at first it was very interesting. It's kind of fascinating to watch yourself dive. But after a while, I was sort of losing interest. And I guess I would describe dying as it's kind of like leaving an airline seat. You look around to make sure you didn't leave your phone or your book. You've got your passport. And then you get up, you grab your stuff, you take maybe one last look at it, and then you leave. And you never really think about that airline seat again. Or checking out of a hotel, very similar process. I mean, you look around, you remember what happened in that hotel room. Maybe you pack your bags, make sure you didn't leave anything, you give it one last glance, and then you leave, and it's just not there anymore. I felt like that. I had no sentiment or sentimentality about my body, about the life that I'd led. I mean, it was just there. It was a bunch of facts. I really didn't have any emotions about it. So I was just sort of in this mood of walking away from it. But I turned around, or I felt compelled to turn around, or something turned me around, and I'm looking away from my body. And what I'm seeing is a big black dot growing from maybe the size of an apple until it was maybe 35 feet in diameter. And it was sort of funnel shaped. I guess you could describe it as the horn of plenty, I guess. And even though it was black, there was illumination inside of the maw of this tunnel. And it was as if the sides of the tunnel were made of thunderclouds. If you've ever flown in an airplane above a thunderstorm and you see that black cloud kind of lighting up from the inside from lightning, it was sort of the same effect. So in a random pattern, all these sort of interior clouds on the walls were lighting up on and off with like their interior lightning, and sort of giving a sort of weak glow to the inside of the tunnel. And I felt myself moving. It was almost like the tunnel was moving toward me and I was stationary. But I turned around again to look back at my body, and it was moving away from me, as well as the tank. And then I was inside this tunnel, and it was just moving, with me feeling stationary and the tunnel walls moving past me. And it was maybe 30 miles an hour is what it felt like as I watched these clouds go by. And it just seemed like I was in this tunnel for a very long time. It felt like about an hour. And then, I'd gotten so far into this tunnel that where I'd started from was no longer visible. That little dot of light where the pool had been had shrunken to the point of a dot, and then it had faded out, and there was just a tunnel. And at one point, I just stopped moving, and I was just floating there, and I had the sensation that I was waiting for something that seemed important. And then I just had the dimmest realization at first that I could hear people talking. And it wasn't really talking like language. It wasn't words. It was not sentences. It was more thoughts, images, intentions. When people talk about telepathy, this is what it felt like. What I thought was interesting was there were probably half a dozen or seven individual beings. Each one had an individuality that came through these tunnel walls to me. They were on the other side of the tunnel wall. There was one who seemed to be in charge, sort of a dominating spirit, who had this, deeper inflection or voice, as you could say. It came off as a very male spirit, speaking to a group of maybe half a dozen of these more female, more caring, more nurturing spirits. So to my consciousness, they seemed female. And the male spirit was not very nurturing and was not harsh, but very demanding, almost like, an earthly father would be, get in there and make me proud, son, sort of attitude. And they were not talking to me. They were speaking to each other, but they were sort of watching me, I guess I could say. And it took a while to get their thoughts so that they translated themselves into my mind. But what I what I gathered was that the female spirits were saying that they needed to let me go all the way to the end of the tunnel to the afterlife, because the earthly life that had been chosen for me, or that I don't know, maybe I chose it, or that was unfolding, was defective, and that it was way too painful and would be crushing, and it would destroy me, and that I didn't have the capability to stand up to that, and we needed to reset the counter and start over. The male spirit was saying that was not true. He disagreed. That I needed to find the courage that had been given to me into this life, and I needed to proceed on with my life and do all the things that I was supposed to do in this life. And the females kept arguing, no, that's going to destroy him. He's not going to be able to survive all that. And then there was a projection on the wall of the tunnel where this male spirit who was in charge of this whole thing projected a view, sort of a three-dimensional movie of the things that were going to happen in my life if I were to go back to Earth and finish things. And it was, I remember some emotions I had watching this, but immediately after this whole incident ended, I had no memory of what had transpired there. I could not tell you what this movie seemed like or looked like, or what it felt like experiencing it, other than maybe a little bit of wonder. At the end of that presentation, the female spirits all concurred that it made more sense to send me back to my life, that there was a lot of meaning here, even though there was a lot of pain, but that I had a lot of things to accomplish. And so then the tunnel walls started moving back, sending me in the direction that I'd entered. This time it was moving dizzyingly fast. I mean, it was like supersonic. And even though it took me an hour to get where I was, it probably took me about 2 seconds to emerge back into the pool. And I saw my body again from maybe 10 feet away for 2 or 3 seconds. And then I slammed into it so hard that I opened my eyes and started coughing. And I looked at my dive buddy, and he was just absolutely dark purple from his regulator being in my mouth, trying to give me his air. And he was surprised that I, came back, and he was still fighting off all these instructors who were trying to get me to the surface, to the ambulance. So I took his regulator out of my mouth and I put it in his. And somehow I managed to get this broken regulator purged out with what I had in my lungs. I think I had to buddy breathe with him using his regulator a couple times to be able to get that done. But eventually the test ended. Then they got everybody out of the pool, and they made me stand at the ambulances while the corpsmen, the medics, checked me out, and they were shining flashlights in my eyes and, checking my pulse and blood pressure and everything else. And one of the medics asked me, what was my experience? Did you see God? Did you go to the other side? And I told him the experience, and he actually found it a little bit frightening. He'd never heard of anybody in their dive sessions who drowned having an experience like that. Everybody apparently went all the way to the other side, and there were meadows and mountains and flowers, a spirit in a white cape or whatever. And mine, stopping halfway while they tried to figure out what to do with me, he found that very frightening. And he literally said to me, Mr. DiMercurio, you need to change something in your life. That doesn't sound very good. So that was sort of the end of it. I passed the course and went on to the submarine force. And I kept wondering if things would be different for me after that experience.
Michael, thank you so much for sharing your experience. They were talking to you about that you had this difficult life and it may destroy you. After this had all happened, did you kind of re-examine your life and see what had been going on that, made them talk about this and give this idea that you would be destroyed or you were living in too much pain?
Sometimes I wonder if they'd never said anything, would I have had the amount of pain I had? Because one of the things that happened to me that changed a little bit was a very limited clairvoyance, not about events, but but more in the I guess you'd call it the mind reading category. It only worked on women. It only worked on people I had a connection to. And it led me into 2 marriages that ended very badly. And I sometimes wonder whether those would have happened had I not had this experience, or if that sort of mind reading ability, if I hadn't had that, would I really have stumbled into these marriages the way it was? And I think that ability probably doomed those relationships, because at the slightest unhappiness of one of my wives, I picked up on that, and it amplified, and things would get worse and worse and worse. And those divorces were so harsh and so bitter and so awful that they induce suicidal ideation at the end of each one of them. So yeah, that was a big part of it. A lot of that pain concerns, connection to children, and trying to maintain a relationship to children in spite of a furious ex-wife that a lot of men, in that position of experience. So it's really nothing unique, I don't think. I think one of my disappointments in life was, although I'd gone to the Naval Academy, I'd been an engineer, and I was very enthusiastic about being a submariner. I was terrible at it. I'd really wanted to go on and command a submarine and be a Navy admiral and make an impact on the world. And I was not a political creature at the time. I tended to speak my mind, and I was not going to be able to climb that ladder. So my Navy career was not distinguished. I did have a good tour of duty on the Cold War submarine Hammerhead, and we did a lot of stuff that I can't even talk about today. That was some very thrilling things that I did have a good contribution to, but in terms of a Navy career, that was not going to happen for me. So part of my disappointment, I fed into starting to write novels about it. And that's kind of what got me into writing in the first place.
Do you think that some of the lessons of this life were more in social nature and relationship nature instead of bravery and fighting battles?
I do, and I think you've hit the nail on the head there. Where in my career after that, I was very more the mission focused person than the people focused person, and I came to a time in my life when I was unemployed, and I was starting to think that I was unemployable, and then I was going to starve to death. And one of my friends in the industry hired me into a job that was 100% people skills. And I thought to myself, I'm going to get fired after the first month, and and again, I'm going to starve to death. It was very strange because, when my mission was to have relationships, then my mission focused personality grew up. So I think that made me more of a relationship focused person, and it changed my entire personality. It was a big building block in who I am and what my soul is. So I think that was really the core of my life experience was making that change.
While wearing your engineering hat and you think about your NDE, do you think it was more real than this 3D world that we live in now?
Yeah, I really do. I remember the first time people started talking seriously about this world being a simulation, a digital simulation. A lot of these ideas matured as we developed our understanding of quantum mechanics, as we have developed computer models and simulations ourselves of worlds. I think just about everybody is familiar with Elon Musk's statement that he thinks there's a high probability that this life we're living in is a simulation. And whether or not you have any belief in that, or you consider it credible or not credible, the fact is that there's a mathematical model that this could be the case. And in fact, that led me to sort of connect with what I saw from my NDE was that when I was in the tunnel and listening to these spirits, they weren't really talking about the earthly life and the afterlife. They were talking about the real world, which was their afterlife, and this world. And when they thought about this existence, they had sort of this attitude like it was not very real. It was almost like it was a contest or a game. So when people 20 years later, 30 years later, started talking about the simulation theory, this resonated with me because that's kind of what I picked up from those guardian spirits.
And I'm glad you called them guardian spirits, because I was going to ask you, who do you think those spirits were?
Well, they seemed in personality very human. So, I don't think we're talking about angels or gods. I think we're talking about people with personalities that seem very human like us, maybe more evolved, maybe more, more wise, if you will. That whole feeling I got when I moved away from my body and felt this wisdom come into me. They had that real breadth of wisdom that, when we talk to the average person here, it's somewhat absent. But they did not seem godlike. They seemed very human. Whether those were, some people talk about a soul circle, or they talk about, your friends from the other side, or grandparents, or what have you. If you do any research into reincarnation, that kind of folds into this, you run into the idea of this concept of a soul circle where individual entities will incarnate multiple times together. Maybe that one, person that's special to you is a friend in this life and was your father in a past life, and you were that person's mother in a life before that, where you interact with each other. One of the other ideas is that people who in this life you might consider your nemesis or your bitter enemy, think of an ex-wife or somebody suing you in a lawsuit. That could actually be somebody in your soul circle who's very important to your development. So some of these ideas resonate. We don't know if they're true or not, or whether they're just hypotheses, but some of them have a ring of truth, especially if you've been through what I've been through.
Do you think that we come here time and time again as a learning experience or playing a game?
Well, I do think there's a learning experience involved. I can't really say that that's the core purpose. And I think there is a purpose and multiple purposes, but I don't think that we really have the capability to know what those are. And we may not know until we're on the other side. The whole, soul school is a very popular idea with a lot of people, but I'm not sure I buy it. It just seems like there's a lot of ways to learn, and this is a very tough way to learn. And, as far as the metaphysical is concerned, if the afterlife is as powerful a place as people believe it to be, why would you need to incarnate into quarks and neutrons and protons and electrons in this universe to be able to learn something? Can't you learn something by going to a library? But there is something apparently special about this existence. I don't know what it is, but it's something real that I think we need to experience. So there's meaning here. And I kind of keep it at that. I keep my mind open to what is the purpose, but so far I haven't really figured that out.
Are you a religious person, or were you before this experience?
Before this experience, I was very religious, very much so. Afterwards, really not at all. I just felt like if my religion were really something as real as I thought it would be, that on the other side, I would experience some elements of that. And I know a lot of people in NDEs have encountered things that coincide with their religious beliefs, but it didn't happen for me. And it led me to a different philosophy. So, And I guess that philosophy is somewhat simple. I think that, this is an incarnation in the physical universe, but I don't think that life ends at death. I think the major part of our existence is probably on the other side, or in that cloud, if you will, the afterlife. There's some meaning here, and there's a purpose, and there's a mission. I don't know that we know what that is. And I do think we probably incarnate multiple times. I don't know how many. I experimented with the idea once, just trying to see if hypnotic regression into a past life makes any sense. And to this day, I'm not really sure if what I experienced was credible, but it seemed to be interesting.
Going back to that other place being hyper real compared to here, do you think it's like in this existence we have a filter on, or can you describe the difference between the two?
I guess I would describe it as, if you're a video game fan, and you spend 6 hours a day playing a video game, you can get convinced of how real the virtual world is there. You can get so involved in it, even emotionally involved in it, that it's a very real part of your life. I don't do any of that for whatever reason. I seem to have whatever part of the brain likes doing that is sort of short-circuited in me. But I know a lot of people who do. And it feels very real. And I think that when those people turn the video game off and they get up from the couch and they walk around their house, or they go to the grocery store, or they walk outside and look at the sunshine and perceive the real world, that's kind of a metaphor as to what this real world / afterlife is like compared to our existence here. It's almost like our existence here is missing a few dimensions, and it's abbreviated, and it's truncated, and it's a model, and that only part of who we are shows up here. Maybe the parts of us that need work or development, and that at the point of death, we're reunited with the rest of our spirit. Some people call that a higher self, and that's the explanation for why this life is a lot different. The people who believe in that simulation theory kind of see things similar here, without there being sort of this metaphysical afterlife. Maybe for them, that real world is wherever the computer programmer is living.
It's fascinating what you just said about how we are here and we're kind of abbreviated. And it just made me think that maybe instead of calling it the higher self, we should call it the complete self.
Yeah, agreed. That's a good concept. Higher self almost makes it sound religious, or disconnects it from who we are. But the complete self does more fold into that idea that only part of our identity is here, and the rest of us is waiting for that reunification. In reading about this, some people are asked the question: is it possible to sort of be in two places at once? Can you incarnate twice in the same time frame? Bringing different parts of your complete self here. Mm-hmm. I think that's an interesting question. I have no idea what the answer is, but it leads to some interesting possibilities. For example, your child may be you.
Yeah, I've talked to that. I've talked on that with guests before, and that is amazing. Like, imagine meeting somebody that is also you. I think they may even call that twin flames.
Yeah, very much so. I have experienced multiple times, maybe only a dozen, but much more than 4 or 5, meeting somebody who I know immediately, even though I've never met them before. And you become fast friends, and you have 100 things to talk about. And even in your first conversation, it feels like you're catching up with that person. And I describe that as, maybe you've met somebody who's in that soul circle of people you know. And, you're immediately having some kind of a shorthand with them. And I've been fortunate enough to have a couple of those people who've been in my life, since we met, 20, 30 years ago.
I hadn't thought about this in a long time, but I don't know if you know of Dolores Cannon, but she talks about there are people here on the earth that are like bots. It's like a bot in a video game, like soulless people here.
The NPC theory, the non-playing character
right.
of the simulation fans.
Right. She said, don't even try to figure out who they are because you can't.
Well, I think we've all run into people who seem to us to be somewhat soulless or one-dimensional, who, really don't have a character. I mean, as a writer, we're all trained to come up with a character arc. You explain who a character is, and then things happen to the character, and he evolves and changes. And at the end of that character arc, he's a different person, or an evolved person, or he's, his personality's sort of been enhanced or changed. But I've met people who are the same today that they were 10 years ago. And you just can't have a discussion with them. I don't know if you remember when the miniseries Roots came out.
Yeah.
And back then people were talking about, find your grandparents and try to get an oral history from your grandparents and ask them about how was life back when they were alive, and what was a typical day like, and educate yourself by talking to these folks. And I remembered I visited with my wife's grandmother, who was in the hospital, and she was very aware and very awake. She was in for physical problems. She went on to live, I don't know, another 5 years. But I tried to conduct that kind of interview with her. She just seemed to be a two-dimensional character. I mean, she'd wake up, she'd eat and sleep, make meals, make the bed, do the laundry, do the grocery shopping, go to sleeping. I mean, there's just no consciousness there. So yeah, I think those exist.
I was thinking, I think I've seen it in the comments below, and I'll probably see it again, that someone's going to say, I think my ex-spouse was one of those characters.
Well, there are people who believe in walk-ins and walk-outs. And I don't know that I ascribe to that belief, but it is tempting to read up on the concept of a walk-in where, you start your life with one soul, this animal part of you, the flesh, and then that soul leaves and another one comes in and takes over. And that can maybe explain some discontinuity of personality of somebody. But I think if there are walk-ins, there are certainly the capability of walk-outs where, you're involved with somebody and they're wonderful. And then one day you wake up and they're a different person, and, marriage falls apart because of it. So there's a lot to consider there. As a scientist and an empiricist, I don't know how you'd even begin to collect data on something like that and come up with a scientific conclusion. All it can be is speculation, but it is interesting to think about.
Sometimes we talk about that people pre-plan these whole lives and or planned exit points, which some of these could be their NDEs if they want to leave or not. Have you considered that?
I was at that motorcycle maintenance session I was at the other day. I found myself sitting next to a guy who's maybe 10 or 15 years older than me. And he described how his oldest son had died at the age of 18. And he was still very, very much upset about it. This had happened, 20 years ago. It was still very much part of his, it was the first thing he thought about when he woke up, and it was the last thing he thought about when he went to sleep. It was a very big part of his life. And he was somewhat tortured by the fact that as a farmer, he, was asked by this kid to play some one-on-one basketball one night. And the farmer, my companion here in the waiting room, was just too tired that day. He'd gotten up at 2:30 in the morning and had been working on the farm, and it was sunset and it was getting dark, and he just wanted to go to bed. And he told the boy no. And the next morning is when the kid died. And he was just really upset about having told that child, no, I can't play basketball with you. And I tried to talk him out of that. And we ended up, coming to a conclusion that even a short life can have tremendous meaning. And I told him, hey, he was only 18 when he died, but I know this individual had tremendous impact on your life and had tremendous meaning to you. So meaning has nothing to do with the length of life. It's just what happens during that life.
With a background of engineering, what is your opinion on what is consciousness?
Well, I'm skeptical that what we consider consciousness is really a physical phenomenon in the brain. Now, certain experiments can lead you to believe that what is really happening physically is consciousnness. For example, a brain injury can change your personality. So does that mean your consciousness resides within the flesh of the 3 pounds inside your skull? Electrotherapy where they, shock you with a high voltage. I had a friend whose mom had that, and twice, and each time it removed about 5 years of memories from her life. So she kept thinking that she was 10 years younger than she actually was. So that's a physical thing. So does that mean that consciousness is here? But the argument against it is all these NDEs where people can tell you what the tattoo on the back of the neck of the nurse was who was assisting and trying to resuscitate you while you were unconscious. And that argues for your consciousness not being contained within your skull. My personal belief is it's probably one of those duality of nature things where it's both at the same time. So we can't really do a lot of experiments or make a definitive case. And this is just an area where there's a lot of speculation. But now that we know more about quantum physics and computation, and we've developed our own models, we see that, just like in a video game, the person controlling the avatar is in a different universe from that actual avatar's experience. And a lot of scientists are starting to believe that is what's happening with consciousness. If there are a way to conclude that experimentally, I haven't heard of it.
I've been speaking with some of my guests, and it seems like the newer theory is that now the body is a manifestation of the consciousness, just like the flame is the manifestation of striking the match.
I think that's a good notion. I believe that our physical appearance probably is communicating something about our consciousness. I don't think that they're disconnected. I think there's, there might be a reason why somebody who's limping is limping, and that it may tie back to some deeper meaning beyond just having had a car accident, for example. But this is a very mystical area that, as an engineer and a scientist, we're sort of in that area where we're just guessing. But I do think that there's something to it.
I agree with you. And I also think maybe that is what contributes to the placebo effect, and or how people just have these miraculous healings where, maybe something changes within your consciousness now that changes how it projects your body, and now you're healed.
The thing about healing that I find interesting is, and we keep coming back to quantum mechanics, is that the nature of matter is very flimsy compared to what we thought it was 100 years ago, when we had, in the early part of the 1900s, discovered atoms and molecules, and we almost had a Newtonian, clockwork nature of what made matter and how energy flowed, and how heat was transferred. And today, that whole idea of what matter is made of is completely different. When you really get down to subatomic particles, they almost more resemble waves, like a photon of light, than they do something that has mass. When you think about the Higgs boson being a subatomic particle that gives other particles mass, we're almost talking about religious concepts when we're talking about subatomic physics. And if that's true, that the nature of matter is so vaporous, is so wispy, that it's almost considered by some to be digital, where if you went really deep into these quarks that make up our subatomic particles, that what you would find is that even deeper, they're just ones and zeros. They're no different than a computer program. Probably a lot of ones and a lot of zeros, but the very deep nature of even a photon of light is that it may be just digital information. And if that's the case, that we're really just talking about programming language, then healing could be nothing more than eliminating the code that created the tumor in the first place. And if you went into computer code and you deleted 3 pages of it and sort of welded it back together so that tumor never existed, and then restarted the program, you're now in a universe where you're healed. So that information theory, that digital theory of reality, sort of supports some of these, what would seem otherwise incredible claims.
It's amazing. And it almost makes me start thinking about, computers becoming sentient and AI, where that's going to end up.
Well, I think we're starting to see that now. The Google employee who was suddenly placed on suspension because he claimed that his chatbot had become self-aware. I think that frightened the Google hierarchy and sort of shook the foundations. Everybody's waiting for Skynet to emerge. I'm hopeful that it's not going to seem like that, but to me, AI, if our reality really is digital and our consciousness is software and just information and ideas, then AI eventually will just be a companion entity. Hopefully one that doesn't destroy the universe, but if it's 1,000 times smarter than we are, who knows what universe we'll be living in 10 years down the road.
Do you think it's possible what Elon Musk is working with Neuralink? From what I understand, just hooking our brain directly into the internet.
I think you'll see a lot of that developed over the next 20 years. And it'll be to the point that depending on how people adapt to it, you would be able to drive a car with your mind.
I mean, it would be,
run your computer program just by thinking about it, or be connected to the internet mentally. I think about the year 1997, before the internet was really in our houses. It might have been something at work that we played with during breaks.
Mm-hmm.
But in 1998, the internet came to the house, and ever since then, life has never really been the same, to the point that when you have an internet outage, it's a catastrophe. It's like you're 10% of who you are. If I hold up my smartphone, when this can't get a signal, all the things I do on that, only 1% of them work. The clock or the calendar. But when it's not connected, it's practically a paperweight. I think eventually, if that Neuralink works, and it looks pretty favorable that it will, the future could be that, if you have a disconnection from the internet from your brain, it'll feel kind of like that smartphone that's lost signal.
Mm-hmm.
You're practically disconnected from all of the mental reality that you'd normally experience.
Are you a Star Trek fan?
I was a big fan of the original series.
Mm-hmm.
I never like the movies, and I could not wrap my mind around the Next Generation or all the spinoffs.
I was going
to me, it was always Captain Kirk.
Oh, I don't blame you. And I was just going to talk to you about the Borg, but you may not be that aware of that villain.
I'm a little bit aware of the Borg. I think that's a good model for what things may look like in the future, except that individuality seems to be a thing. And people prize their individuality. I don't see us giving that up. So I still think of people holding on to their individual identities, even in that matrix.
It's interesting to think about that. If we get that developed where we understand, like you were saying earlier, that our bodies are just computer code, that we get to the ability where at will we can just be like a shapeshifter and start changing our body.
Well, I think if we ever encounter an alien, space alien personality, we might be running into somebody who's mastered exactly that. I'm a big fan of seeing some of these UFO phenomena where the laws of physics seem to be being broken, where something will change direction immediately and zoom off. I think if our universe is digital, you're seeing that is just the manifestation of code. And for all we know, that could be something sort of like an entity deciding to, shapeshift or change its location. Instead of being here, it's going to instantaneously be over there. You could do that in a computer game, but you can't do it in real life yet.
Yeah, it's fascinating that you say that. I recently saw an interview with Dr. Michio Kaku, the physicist. I'm not sure if you're aware of who he is, but they were talking.
I think you're speaking of.
Yeah, and they were talking about the UFOs, and he said that they are traveling somewhere between Mach 8 and Mach 25, and he said at that speed you would just crush your bones. And I never even thought about this, but you're not hearing sonic booms either. So it makes a lot of sense what you're saying about the computer code and just, things are changing within the matrix here.
Well, exactly. It's almost as if it's hacking a code, so that an object is here in our physical universe, but it gets hacked to stop existing here, and now it exists here. But to our eyes, it looked like it traveled, faster than the speed of light from left to right. So that again supports the idea of, what is this reality? Is it digital? I think about Stephen Hawking's statement a lot, that if we meet space aliens, we won't be meeting the biological entities, we'll be meeting their AI that killed them and then went out into space.
I had Dr. Eben Alexander on. I don't know if you're aware of him, but he's the Harvard neurosurgeon who had an NDE. And he said he read somebody else's research, another brain surgeon, and according to him and that brain surgeon, you can cut out any part of the brain and you will not lose long-term memory. You will lose the ability to convert short-term memory into long-term memory, but those long-term memories are still there, and he calls it being stored in the quantum hologram, which, maybe it's stored in the complete self or whatever.
I think that's very interesting, and it's very true. I remember when my daughter was going through elementary school, she had some minor dyslexia and minor learning disability that we all got over by putting her in some of these special classes where they had more innovative techniques in teaching. And some of these people talked about, we are literally rewiring her brain to process information differently than most people process it. And by the time we're done doing that, she'll be completely okay and completely normal. And that turned out to be true. And I always thought about that rewiring of the brain. It sounds very much like your neuroscientist friend is sort of onto something there. I'm particularly interested in the short-term memory issue because of the impact of age on short-term memory. We may be seeing a similar phenomenon. with maybe the brain is degrading physically. It's probably constantly rewiring itself to be able to continue on with the personality, but short-term memories can be affected.
Yeah.
I think Alzheimer's research and dementia research is also trying to feed into this to figure out how to fix that. And, maybe in 20 years, we'll have better results than we have today.
Yeah. Well, I think there's just maybe limitation of matter. I mean, if you come here to play this game, bodies only last so long unless we can figure out how to hack them and regrow the body. As far as I understand it, aging is just the body's ability to repair itself gets slower and slower and slower, where it finally just loses. So if maybe we can hack that component, maybe bodies will keep going forever. I don't know.
I don't know. I have a little bit different philosophy of age. The physical changes seem to have some meaning beyond degradation. And the mental changes seem to have some meaning beyond just pure development. It's almost as if the experience of being human is not fully realized until you've gone through an entire cycle. There were times when I thought that I had never really, in any incarnation been old. I always felt like I was, you've heard people talk about they're an old soul. I always felt like a young soul. I felt like I'd never really experienced much in the old age category. And now I am. And I'm experiencing it much differently than I thought I would. I thought it would just be living with degradation. But if anything, it almost feels like there's enhancements that happen beyond just the ability to learn from experiences or from reading, or what have you. It's an expansion of consciousness that occurs without volition. And I feel differently now than I did 10 or 20 years ago, with what seems to be an expanded brain power, if you will, or ability to read certain people is enhanced, and I have no physical explanation for that. It just seems to be a soul development sort of situation. So I think there's meaning in growing older and dying. So I think I would not like that universe where we stay 40 years old forever.
All right, Mike, I need to switch gears with you because we're already deep into the time here. Now, we kind of touched on it. I said that you're a best-selling author, but I didn't say that you're a best-selling author in submarines or submarine adventures. And your newest book is called Dark Transit. Can you tell us a little bit about that book?
The Dark Transit came out late last year in December, and it's the first in an intended series about a young officer who shows up to what they call a project submarine. And there's a few project submarines in the U.S. Navy. They don't report to the normal Navy reporting structure. They report to the president, and they do super special, super secret operations that only a few people in the entire government know about. So they tend to be very interesting. So this young officer named Anthony Pacino shows up at this submarine, the USS Vermont, a Virginia class, and he engages in what is one of the most crazy special operations ever devised for the submarine force. And we follow him as he sort of grows up in that mission. So that was about a year and a half in the making, and tremendous fun to write. I had no idea what was going to happen, and I kept going to work to write it to see what would happen next.
Would you say that these are kind of like submarine versions of Tom Clancy books?
Well, it's interesting you say that, because I think if you take a reader who likes Tom Clancy and you put one of my books in front of him, he gets a lot of the things that he would like out of Tom Clancy, but he gets a lot more character development and sort of life meaning, and some of the things that we've been talking about here over and above just the knobology and the buttons and the war. There's some very metaphysical things that might be happening in the background. When a character is experiencing death, I think I can describe that better than a techno thriller author could. And a lot of my readers just feel like they're transported into a real life where they can really feel these things. So I think that has set me apart, and it's given me a very devoted readership, and hopefully I can put out half a dozen more of these before I need to hang up the laptop.
I'd been thinking lately that what I love about Star Wars and The Matrix and Dune is that these stories are not only action, but they're spiritual as well. You know, you've got the Force, and Dune, you've got the spice, and Matrix, obviously. Do you put any of those aspects into your books?
I think that there's some very deep themes there. When I talked about that sort of fatherly guardian spirit, sometimes you see that in my books in the form of, say, a senior admiral talking to a submarine captain or to a junior officer, that wisdom that goes beyond just the years, just sort of the soul wisdom. And there are times where I sort of put in my own experience of that feeling of being a young soul into a character, which is, in Dark Transit, that junior officer who's the main character feels that he has no confidence, and he's a heroic spirit, but he just feels inexperienced and young and not very confident. And then he goes through the character arc of this secret mission that almost brings everybody involved to the point of death, and perhaps even beyond and back again. And in doing that, I think you see a lot of that maybe mystical things that I brought back with me, that I think make some of those fictions that you described much more meaningful than just the plot itself.
It sounds like you're getting into Campbell's, how he does the circle of the hero. You know what I'm speaking of?
I've seen that graphically before, and it sort of depicts a lot of things that I think that I do instinctively. We were talking before about non-playable characters and bots, and it's just interesting that I fight against that, because you'll have 100 people in a novel, and only a dozen of them really have fully developed characters and souls, and the others tend to be bots. But can you take a paragraph and give a bot something that gives him personality, and that separates the professional from a fan fiction writer.
Do you interact with the public? For example, if someone wants to write to you and ask you questions, are you open to that? And if so, should they reach you like on your website or what?
I tend to do that through Facebook Messenger. I do get a lot of comments, or I might post something on Facebook about, I just finished chapter 7, and it almost killed me. And I'll get comments there, or people will write me on Facebook Messenger and have questions. And actually, a long time ago through my website, I would get a lot of emails, and sort of in the email era, there was a lot of back and forth that seems to be much abbreviated today. If you really think about how our interpersonal communication has changed in 40 years, everything now is 140 characters. So a lot of that fan contact has come down from 2-page long emails to 2 sentences. So it's still fun, but it's a lot shorter, and it feels like there's less. But I get a lot of comments that people have read every book I've ever written and are eagerly waiting for the next one. You get that occasional shot in the arm from something like that keeps you writing.
I think that's amazing. You're working on these books. Do you have anything else that you're working on that you'd like us to know about?
Well, this is 100% of my focus, because I want to get about 4 or 5 more books out before mentally I'm not really able to do that. So My medical history is a duplicate of my mom's. When my mom was 75, she was sharp as a tack. When she was 80, she didn't even know who I was. So I've got this sort of scheduled out until I'm 75, and then I'm going to just stop. And maybe I'll read some of the things. And sort of, so that's what I'm working on. I don't have other writing projects now because this is all consuming. I keep a whiteboard by my desk, and every day it changes a little bit, but I know where I want a scene to go, and I know I've got 5 scenes that are sort of queuing up to be written, like planes on a taxiway waiting to take off. So that takes 100% of me, maybe more.
Do these stories just come to you, or do you have to sit there and think through them and grind them out?
Well, I think they come from beyond. I think they're, a lot of writers feel like they're channeling God or what have you, and that the real writer is not they themselves. We've talked about higher self or the complete self, and I very much think that maybe some of this writing comes from outside my personality. I think that I enable it, and I think that I think about it a lot, and I contribute ideas to it, but there are a lot of times where what I'm writing is very external to myself. I've seen plot twists that I didn't see coming until the words landed on the page. There was one novel, I think it was Phoenix Sub-Zero, that the bad guys were doing so well that about 80% through the book, I had to stop. I could not figure out how the good guys were going to win. I had no idea. It's like playing chess against yourself, and I was losing. And the publisher started threatening me, and I had to get that last 20% of the manuscript written in about 4 days. So I did it without sleep. And I was on the train to New York City to deliver the manuscript, and my publisher asked, well, how did it turn out? And I literally told him, I don't know. I'm going to have to read it right along with you. I have no memory of what happened at the end of this book.
Wow.
And so as I read it, it truly felt like I was reading somebody else's work. I mean, don't get me wrong, it was great. It was fantastic. I mean, and I say that with a sense of humility, because I'm really not praising myself, I'm praising the work. I don't know where this came from, but it turned out amazing. And it was not me sitting there trying to grunt out a sentence. It just flowed from someplace beyond.
It's amazing to hear that from you, because I interview people, and some people will say they do automatic writing or channeled writing. So to get another viewpoint from an experienced author is, it's fascinating.
There's a lot of times where I won't know what's going to happen next, and I just stop, and I wake up in the morning and I have a scene in my head, and I have to get it on the page before it evaporates. And I think to myself, I really didn't think of that. That just sort of was like mailed into me. Mm-hmm. So it is very bizarre experience writing.
It's an unconscious digital download.
Well, as long as the writing's good at the end of the day, I don't care where it came from.
All right. Well, if somebody is new to your submarine stories and they want to read all of your books, which book should they start with?
Well, I would start with Dark Transit. And my advice is always to read the most recent one I've done, because they're all standalone.
Okay.
Very much. You might see a reference to the main character's father, and maybe the story about him comes out that is more, fully the plot of another novel that might get you interested in seeing the backstory. But everything happens now. It's self-contained. So, I always tell people, read the one I just wrote. So Dark Transit is my recommendation. At the moment, it's my Gatsby.
Before we finish up, can you leave us with one last positive message?
If there's a positive message that I would give just about anybody, it's that life has a meaning that's much deeper than waking up, making breakfast, going to work, eating lunch, finishing work, having dinner, going to the gym, watching TV, and going to bed. There's some very deeply important things that are in this universe that need to be observed and interacted with and learned. And it's so much more than we really think it is, and it's difficult to describe. But I think life is very important, and I'm distressed sometimes when people don't see that.
Mike, thank you again for being my guest. I appreciate you, and I wish you massive success with your books.
Thank you, Jeff. Really appreciate being here.
Thanks for watching the JeffMara podcast. I really appreciate you. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. And if you do, there are loyalty badges and other perks depending on your level of membership. All you need to do is click the join button underneath the video to find out more. Thank you for your support.